On October 5th, 2011, Steve Jobs died of pancreatic cancer at 56 years old. At the time of his death, Steve Jobs was worth an estimated $10.2 billion. Having that net worth at this time made him one of the wealthiest people in the world. Now, this may not be a surprise to most of us because after all, he was one of the three founders of Apple, which now has a market cap of over $2.5 trillion, making it the second most valuable company in the world right now. But the thing is that the company we know him for actually had very little to do with the fortune he amassed over his lifetime. It's quite coincidental because by assumption, you would always think that Steve Jobs' money was made from Apple, but in reality, it actually wasn't. So to start this story, we need to take it all the way back to when Apple was founded. Apple was famously founded by Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and Ronald Wayne in this California garage in 1976. The business found its initial investments from Steve selling his Volkswagen bus and Steve Wozniak selling his high-end pocket calculator. These funds were then utilized for the development of the Apple I and the Apple II desktop computers, which presented an easier method for interaction with the large computers at the time, making them appealing to the public. During this time frame, Ronald Wayne, the often forgotten third founder of Apple, would sell his 10% share of the company for $800. But unfortunately for him, those today would be worth over $250 billion. Just think about this if you didn't buy Nvidia stock months ago. Anyways, fast forward to the 1980s, and the company had found tremendous success selling these personal computers. But fast forward down the line a little bit, all was not well within the Apple Corporation at this time. A struggle between Steve Jobs and the board of directors ended with Steve Jobs being fired from his creative position in the company by the very same man that Steve Jobs made CEO. This man was John Sculley. By the mid-1980s, Apple's success was kind of plummeting, and Steve Jobs saw the solution to be an introduction of an exceptionally powerful personal computer, which was simply too expensive for the average consumer. The more business-minded John Sculley, along with the majority of the board backing him, saw the future in the company differently and wanted to move more in a commercially viable direction, selling computers that were less remarkable but did bring in enough revenue. Inevitably, this meant cutting off funding for Jobs' passion projects and his vision by effectively removing him from the day-to-day operations of the company entirely. Clearly, being the founder of the company, Steve was not pleased with this decision, to say the least. Despite still holding a significant number of shares in the company, he sold all of them but one of his Apple shares in protest of him being fired. The reason for this is kind of weird, but it was still calculated and will be tied into the story later on. But now, Steve Jobs was unemployed and on the lookout for a new project to make his. And fortunately, he found this with a little offshoot of Lucasfilm. Lucasfilm is a production company most famous for producing Star Wars if you didn't know who they are. The company graphics team under Lucasfilm actually had separated into their own independent company with the ambition of one day being able to make a movie entirely on a computer, which was a radical concept at the time. But nonetheless, this idea intrigued Steve Jobs, who was fired partially for dedicating too much time to overly ambitious projects, kind of like this one. The problem with this is the idea it simply wasn't feasible with the technology at the time. Significant investments were required to keep the company afloat until such a time where computer technology caught up enough to actually make a full digital animation even possible. This period led Steve Jobs to gradually invest over $50 million into the company as they worked on developing hardware to turn this vision into a reality. Their most market-ready product was the Pixar image computer, which was an extremely costly device that ended up being used more for medical imaging than for actually any creative endeavors or its intended purpose. Given the hefty price tag of $500,000 each per unit, only about 300 units were sold. This was sufficient to keep the company operational, but additional funds were necessary to sustain the intense R&D efforts. Steve Jobs willingly provided this funding, partly because he viewed it as a sound investment and partly as a personal challenge to Apple, because he criticized the boards for having a lack of visionary long-term perspective on the technological capabilities of the future. The extent to which this investment was motivated by spite is open to interpretation, but now let's get to the part on why Jobs still held that one Apple share. Well, the simple reason was so that he could attend the annual shareholder meeting and see what they were up to. So it's fair to say that this wasn't all savvy investing despite any personal motives, though it still did prove to be a great investment down the line. By the mid-90s, Jobs controlled a majority of Pixar, right as computers caught up enough to produce the company's very first film, the massively successful Toy Story. company went on to produce a series of massively successful movies while working closely alongside Walt Disney Pictures, which would eventually offer to buy the company for $7.4 billion in 2006. This purchase was not paid in cash, however, but rather in Disney stock, and this transaction made Jobs the largest shareholder in Disney at the time, but also crowned him with the title of billionaire. Now, anybody who has been paying any attention to the movie industry in the past decade will know that Disney has been growing rapidly. Steve Jobs, of course, was famously rehired as Apple's CEO when the company was mere weeks away from going completely bankrupt, only to guide the company once again to amazing new heights with the introduction of the products including the iPod, the iPad, and of course, the infamous iPhone. He was well rewarded for his success with share bonuses that were worth billions in their own right, but upon his death in 2011, his Disney shares still massively outvalued his Apple shares, which is pretty interesting. Either way, it could have been way worse because he could have sold a 10% stake in Apple for only $800. Now, if you want to know how Apple got its name, listen to this. Steve Jobs was known for spending weeks eating the same type of food, such as apples or carrots, and then abruptly stopping or going on a fast. This is called a fruitarian diet. And funny enough, Steve Jobs visited an apple orchard, and the experience inspired the company name.